Little black girl gave a secret signal to her parrot. The courtroom fell silent. Seconds later. Enjoy the story. The morning sun filtered through the grimy windows of the Chicago courthouse, casting long shadows across the marble floors, where 6-year-old Dorothy Mae Williams sat clutching a small birdcage. Her cotton dress, pressed carefully by her grandmother's weathered hands, bore tiny daisies that seemed to mock the gravity of the moment. Inside the cage, a brilliant green parrot named Charlie shifted restlessly, his emerald feathers catching the light like scattered jewels. The bird's neck bore a peculiar ring of missing plumes, a silent testament to trauma that mirrored the child's own invisible wounds. Dorothy's braids, woven with yellow ribbon, framed a face that held wisdom far beyond her years. Her dark eyes swept across the imposing courtroom, taking in the sea of white faces that stared back with mixtures of curiosity, pity, and barely concealed skepticism. Some whispered behind manicured hands about the little colored girl with the bird, their voices carrying the casual cruelty that had become Dorothy's constant companion since that terrible day 3 weeks ago. The weight of silence pressed against Dorothy's chest like a stone. She hadn't spoken since the incident, not to the police officers who questioned her with impatient sighs, not to the social workers who documented her case with clinical detachment, not even to her beloved grandmother, who rocked her each night as tears fell without sound. The world had decided she was broken, unreliable, too young and too black to be believed. But Dorothy knew something they didn't. Charlie remembered everything. Judge Harold Morrison, a towering figure with silver hair and steel-rimmed glasses, surveyed the courtroom with the authority of 3 decades on the bench. His reputation was built on fairness, but even fair judges operated within systems that favored those who looked like the defendant, wealthy, white, and wrapped in the protective armor of respectability. Today would test whether justice could speak through the voiceless. At the defendant's table sat Richard Brennan, a pillar of Chicago's North Shore community. His navy suit was impeccably tailored, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his hands folded with the confidence of a man who had never faced real consequences. Real estate mogul, charity board member, friend to mayors and police commissioners, Brennan's life was a carefully constructed monument to success and civic virtue. The allegations against him seemed almost ridiculous. Attempted kidnapping of a child from the South Side. Who would believe such a thing about a man who had donated millions to children's charities? Dorothy's grandmother, Evelyn Williams, sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, her church dress immaculate, despite the threadbare patches at the elbows. At 72, she had raised 5 children through segregation, worked double shifts as a hospital cleaner, and buried a son in Vietnam. Now she faced her greatest battle yet, fighting for a granddaughter whose silence threatened to become her prison. Evelyn's weathered hands gripped her purse tightly, knuckles white with the effort of containing decades of righteous anger. The prosecutor, James Harrison, shuffled his papers with barely concealed frustration. A black man who had clawed his way through law school and into the state's attorney's office, he understood the impossible mathematics of this case. Without Dorothy's testimony, he had circumstantial evidence at best. Tire tracks, a partial license plate, and the word of a traumatized child who could no longer speak. Against him stood not just Brennan's expensive legal team, but the weight of a system that had always found ways to protect men like the defendant. Defense attorney Margaret Sterling rose with predatory grace, her red suit a declaration of war against the prosecution's case. She had built her career defending the wealthy and powerful, understanding that juries preferred stories that confirmed their comfortable assumptions about the world. A respected businessman versus a silent black child from the projects, she had orchestrated acquittals with far less favorable circumstances. The courtroom itself seemed to lean toward the defense, its oak panels and brass fixtures whispering of old money and older prejudices. The American flag hung motionless in the stifling air, while portraits of past judges, all white, all male, gazed down with marble indifference. Dorothy felt small in this place, her birdcage a fragile shield against the weight of institutional doubt. But as the morning light shifted and danced across Charlie's green feathers, something stirred in Dorothy's chest. Not quite hope, but something fiercer. She had chosen to bring Charlie for a reason that the adults couldn't understand. The bird had been with her that day, hidden in the bushes where she had been playing before Brennan's black sedan rolled slowly down her street. Charlie had seen what happened when the friendly man with the silver hair and gentle smile had reached through the open car window, his hand closing around her wrist with surprising strength. What would unfold in the coming hours would prove that sometimes truth finds its voice in the most unexpected ways. As lawyers shuffled papers and judges called for order, neither side suspected that a small girl and her beloved bird were about to shatter assumptions about power, voice, and the devastating cost of silence in America's halls of justice. The opening arguments began with Sterling painting Dorothy as a fantasist, a traumatized child whose imagination had conjured monsters from shadows. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she intoned, "we cannot convict a pillar of our community based on the confused memories of a child who has not spoken a word since the alleged incident. Where is the evidence? Where is the testimony? What we have before us today is tragedy compounded by misunderstanding." Her words fell like hammer blows, each one designed to diminish Dorothy's credibility before it could be established. Harrison rose to counter, his voice carrying the weight of generations who had fought for the right to be heard in American courtrooms. "The defense would have you believe that silence equals fiction," he began, his eyes finding Dorothy's across the room. "But sometimes silence is the loudest cry for help we can hear. Sometimes the absence of words speaks volumes about the presence of trauma. This child's silence is not evidence of falsehood. It is evidence of terror so profound that it has stolen her voice." The jury, 10 white faces, 2 black, sat unmoved by rhetoric they had heard countless times before. Chicago juries had heard promises about justice and truth, had seen children take stands that crumbled under cross-examination, had watched wealthy defendants walk free, while poor accusers were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. Today felt no different, except for the strange presence of a green parrot, whose black eyes seemed to watch the proceedings with unusual intensity. Dorothy's world had changed forever on a Tuesday afternoon when autumn leaves crunched beneath her patent leather shoes. She had been playing by the chain-link fence that separated her grandmother's small yard from the alley, using a stick to draw pictures in the dirt, while Charlie perched on a low branch of the old oak tree. The approaching sedan had seemed harmless at first, just another car navigating the narrow streets of the South Side. But when the window rolled down and the smiling man beckoned her closer with promises of candy and a ride to see ponies, Dorothy's instincts had screamed danger, even as her 6-year-old politeness urged her to respond to the friendly stranger. The moment his fingers closed around her wrist, the moment he whispered, "Come with me, little girl," in a voice that didn't match his gentle expression, her world had exploded into terror, and Charlie had erupted into protective fury, screeching and diving at the man's face until he released Dorothy and sped away, leaving nothing but tire marks and trauma in his wake. The prosecution called their first witness, Detective Maria Santos, a 20-year veteran who had interviewed Dorothy immediately after the incident. Santos testified about finding the child crouched beneath her grandmother's porch, clutching the birdcage while Charlie paced frantically inside, his usual cheerful chatter replaced by agitated silence. "The child was catatonic," Santos explained, her voice tight with professional restraint. "She wouldn't speak, wouldn't eat, wouldn't let go of that birdcage. We've seen trauma responses before, but this level of withdrawal in someone so young, it was heartbreaking." Sterling's cross-examination was surgical in its cruelty. "Detective Santos, in your 20 years of experience, how many cases have you investigated where the only witness was a mute child and her pet bird?" The question drew nervous laughter from the gallery, but Dorothy felt each word like a physical blow. "Is it possible that this child's silence stems not from trauma, but from the knowledge that her story isn't true?" Santos bristled, but the damage was done. Doubt had been planted in fertile ground. The courtroom dynamics shifted subtly as the morning wore on. Spectators began checking their watches, jurors stifled yawns, and even Judge Morrison seemed to be going through the motions of a case whose outcome felt predetermined. Dorothy watched it all with growing understanding. This was theater, and she was just a prop in someone else's story. But Charlie remained alert, his head cocked at an angle that suggested he was listening to something the humans couldn't hear. Late in the morning, as the prosecution struggled to build a case without their key witness's voice, Dorothy made a decision that would change everything. Rising slowly from her seat in the front row, she walked toward the witness stand with Charlie's cage clutched against her chest. Judge Morrison's gavel cracked like thunder. "Young lady, return to your seat immediately. "You are not scheduled to testify." But Dorothy kept walking, her small feet echoing in the sudden silence. When she reached the witness stand, she set Charlie's cage on the rail and looked directly at Richard Brennan for the first time since entering the courtroom. What happened next would be debated and analyzed for years to come, but every person in that courtroom would remember the moment when Dorothy Mae Williams placed one small finger against the side of Charlie's cage and made a sound, not a word, but a soft clicking noise that seemed to unlock something in the bird's memory. Charlie's feathers ruffled, his head snapped toward Brennan, and in a voice that carried every ounce of terror from that Tuesday afternoon, he began to speak. "No, no, no, bad man. Help me. Grandmama, help." The words that Dorothy couldn't say poured from Charlie's beak in her exact voice, complete with the rising panic of a child in mortal danger. But the bird wasn't finished. His black eyes fixed on Brennan, he continued, "Silver hair man, black car. Come here, little girl. Charlie." Help Charlie save Dorothy. The courtroom erupted in chaos as spectators shouted, lawyers objected, and Judge Morrison pounded his gavel repeatedly. But through it all, Charlie kept talking, recounting details of the attempted abduction that only someone who had been there could know. The smell of leather seats, the sound of jazz music playing on the radio, the way Brennan's voice had changed from friendly to threatening when Dorothy tried to pull away. The break that followed lasted 2 hours instead of the scheduled 15 minutes, as lawyers from both sides huddled in urgent conference with the judge. Sterling argued vehemently that a parrot's mimicry was not testimony, while Harrison countered that the bird's words provided crucial corroborating evidence of Dorothy's truthfulness. Judge Morrison, faced with a legal precedent unlike anything in his 30 years on the bench, ultimately ruled that while Charlie's statement could not be considered direct testimony, the bird's specific knowledge of details not released to the public raised serious questions about the defense's portrayal of Dorothy as an unreliable witness. When court resumed, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Jurors who had seemed bored now leaned forward with intense focus. Spectators whispered urgently among themselves. Even the usually impassive court reporter looked shaken. Dorothy remained at the witness stand, her hand resting protectively on Charlie's cage, while the bird continued to mutter fragments of that terrible afternoon. Dorothy scared. "Bad man want take. Charlie bite finger. Grandmama, where are you?" Each phrase was delivered in Dorothy's own cadence, her own inflection, creating an eerie ventriloquism that made several jurors visibly uncomfortable. The prosecution, energized by this unexpected development, moved quickly to capitalize on the moment. Harrison called Dr. Rebecca Chen, an expert in avian behavior and cognition, who testified about Parrot's extraordinary ability to associate words with specific contexts and emotions. African gray parrots like Charlie have cognitive abilities equivalent to a 5-year-old child, Dr. Chen explained. They don't just mimic sounds, they learn to associate specific phrases with specific situations. If this bird is reproducing detailed dialogue from a traumatic event, it suggests he was present and emotionally engaged during that event. Sterling's objections came fast and fierce, but the judge allowed the testimony to continue. Dr. Chen went on to explain that Charlie's missing neck feathers, the ring of bare skin that Dorothy's grandmother had attributed to molting, were actually consistent with stress-induced plucking behavior. Birds often engage in self-destructive behaviors when they witness violence or experience trauma, she testified. The pattern of feather loss on this particular bird is consistent with acute psychological distress. The afternoon brought a parade of character witnesses for Brennan, bank presidents, charity board members, and civic leaders who testified to his sterling reputation and generous spirit. But their glowing testimonials seemed hollow against Charlie's raw recitation of events. Each time Brennan's name was mentioned, the bird would shift restlessly and mutter phrases like "silver hair bad" and "Dorothy run fast," creating an unsettling counterpoint to the defense's attempts at reputation rehabilitation. As the day wore on, Dorothy found her voice returning in small increments. When the judge asked if she needed water, she whispered "yes, please," so softly that he had to lean forward to hear. When her grandmother approached during a break, Dorothy managed to say, "I'm okay, Grandmama," before burying her face against the older woman's shoulder. Charlie seemed to sense her growing confidence, his own vocalizations becoming clearer and more coherent as the afternoon progressed. The turning point came when Sterling made the tactical error of questioning Dorothy's credibility directly. "Your Honor, We're being asked to convict my client based on the ravings of a traumatized bird and a child who has conveniently recovered her voice at the precise moment it serves the prosecution's case." The words hung in the air like poison, but they had an unexpected effect. Dorothy Mae Williams stood up slowly, looked directly at the defense attorney, and in a voice that carried every ounce of her grandmother's dignity and strength, said, "Charlie doesn't lie. Bad men do. Have you ever witnessed or experienced a moment when someone's silence was finally broken by an act of courage or truth? Please share your thoughts in the comments below." The simple statement resonated through the courtroom like a bell, its clarity cutting through hours of legal maneuvering and procedural debate. Dorothy's voice, though still soft and hesitant, carried absolute conviction. Charlie, as if responding to his beloved human's newfound courage, began reciting the events of that Tuesday afternoon with startling precision. The time of day, the make and model of Brennan's car, even the jazz song that had been playing on his radio, details that investigators later confirmed from traffic camera footage and witness statements they hadn't previously connected to the case. Judge Morrison called for an extended recess, during which Detective Santos received an urgent call from her partner. A search of Brennan's North Shore mansion, authorized by the new evidence Charlie had provided, had uncovered a disturbing collection in his study: photographs of children at playgrounds, school dismissal schedules, and a detailed map of South-side neighborhoods marked with locations where children commonly played unsupervised. Most damning of all was a leather journal containing detailed fantasies about rescuing children from unsuitable environments, with Dorothy's address circled in red ink and annotated with her daily routine. When court reconvened, the prosecution presented this new evidence while Charlie continued his intermittent commentary, now speaking in full sentences that left no doubt about his presence during the attempted abduction. "Silver hair man say pretty little girl need better home. Dorothy say no thank you, mister. Silver hair man grab arm tight. Charlie fly down from tree. Charlie bite finger hard. Man say bad words. Dorothy run fast to grandmama house. Charlie follow Dorothy. Charlie protect Dorothy always." The defense's carefully constructed narrative began crumbling as additional evidence emerged. Phone records showed calls from Brennan's office to the elementary school Dorothy attended, inquiring about enrollment procedures under the guise of considering a donation. Security footage from a convenience store near Dorothy's home showed Brennan's distinctive sedan on 3 separate occasions in the weeks leading up to the incident, always during the hours when children would be walking home from school. Sterling's closing argument was desperate and increasingly shrill, attacking the credibility of bird testimony and suggesting that Dorothy had been coached by prosecutors seeking to make headlines. But her words fell flat against the weight of accumulating evidence and the simple truth of a child who had found her voice again. Harrison's closing was masterful in its restraint. He let Dorothy's own words and Charlie's unwavering testimony speak for themselves, reminding the jury that justice sometimes comes from the most unexpected sources. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours, a remarkably short time for a case that had seemed impossible to prove that morning. When they returned with their verdict, Dorothy sat holding Charlie's cage while her grandmother's weathered hand rested on her shoulder. Judge Morrison read the verdict with solemn dignity: guilty on all counts, including attempted kidnapping, stalking, and possession of child exploitation materials. Brennan's carefully constructed facade finally cracked as bailiffs approached, with handcuffs, his face contorting with rage as he screamed about believing animals over decent people. But the most powerful moment came not with the verdict, but in the days that followed. Dorothy's story spread beyond Chicago's courthouse, inspiring other children who had been silenced by trauma to find their voices again. Letters poured in from around the country, many from adults who shared their own stories of childhood encounters with predators and the long journey toward healing. Charlie became an unlikely symbol of loyalty and protection, his image appearing on posters for child safety organizations and victim advocacy groups. 3 months after the trial, Dorothy Mae Williams walked into Jefferson Elementary School with her head held high and Charlie's cage in her hand. The principal had initially balked at allowing a bird in the classroom, but Dorothy's teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had advocated fiercely for an exception. "This child has found her voice through that bird," she argued. "If Charlie helps her feel safe enough to learn and grow, then Charlie belongs in my classroom." The other children were fascinated by the talking parrot, who seemed to understand their feelings and always knew the right thing to say when someone was sad or scared. Dorothy's academic progress was remarkable. Her test scores soared as her confidence grew, and she began participating in class discussions with an insight that impressed her teachers. Charlie, meanwhile, learned new phrases that reflected their changed circumstances. Dorothy, smart girl, school is fun, friends are good, and most importantly, Dorothy, safe now. The bird's vocabulary expanded to include encouraging words and gentle corrections, becoming a feathered therapist who helped other children work through their own fears and anxieties. The Williams family's financial situation also improved dramatically. A victims' compensation fund established after the trial provided for Dorothy's education and therapy, while Evelyn Williams was finally able to retire from her hospital job and focus on raising her granddaughter. They moved to a small house with a yard, where Charlie could fly freely during supervised outdoor time, his missing neck feathers gradually growing back as his trauma healed alongside Dorothy's. Richard Brennan received a sentence of 25 years to life, with eligibility for parole only after serving a minimum of 20 years, a term that recognized both the severity of his crimes and the courage of the child who had stopped him. The investigation that followed his conviction uncovered evidence linking him to several unsolved cases of missing children from low-income neighborhoods, cases that had received minimal police attention when they were first reported. Dorothy's bravery had not only saved herself, but potentially countless other children who might have become Brennan's victims. On the first anniversary of the trial, Dorothy and Charlie visited the courthouse where their journey toward justice had begun. Now 7 years old and confident in her own voice, Dorothy spoke to a gathering of victim advocates, prosecutors, and child welfare workers about the importance of believing children and the power of unexpected allies. Charlie, perched on her shoulder with his neck feathers fully restored, occasionally interjected with commentary that made the audience laugh and reminded everyone that healing takes many forms. The legacy of Dorothy Mae Williams and Charlie the Parrot extended far beyond their individual story. Their case prompted legislative changes that improved protections for child witnesses and expanded the definition of allowable evidence in abuse cases. Law enforcement agencies began training officers to recognize trauma responses in children and to work with child psychologists to create alternative methods of testimony for young victims. Most importantly, their story became a beacon of hope for families who had been dismissed, ignored, or silenced by systems that should have protected them. As Dorothy grew older, she never forgot the lesson that courage can come from the most unexpected sources, and that sometimes the smallest voices can shatter the greatest silences. She carried Charlie's cage less frequently as the years passed, but the bond between them remained unbreakable, a testament to the power of unconditional love and the truth that sometimes the most profound wisdom comes not from those who speak the loudest, but from those who listen with their hearts and respond with their souls. Dorothy Mae Williams learned that her voice mattered not because of who believed it, but because of the truth it carried, and Charlie, her faithful guardian and unexpected hero, proved that protection comes in many forms, sometimes with feathers, sometimes with fierce loyalty, and always with the courage to speak when speaking matters most. Their story reminds us that justice doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it sings, and sometimes it squawks with the indignant fury of love protecting innocence. You are amazing. If you genuinely enjoyed this story, please leave a like and subscribe. It's a great feedback for me. If it made you feel seen, heard, or simply reminded you that change is still possible, share it with someone who needs a little hope today. See you.